Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this dialogue on the AI cybercrime revolution, costs, consequences, and countermeasures. My name is Nico Heller, and this is Reboot 2030, a Democracy School podcast. Studies show that identity fraud cost 52 billion globally in 2021, with ransomware costs potentially reaching astonishing 265 billion annually by 2031. In this episode of Reboot 2030, we examine AI's impact on cybersecurity, focusing on its potential to revolutionize cybercrime through sophisticated attacks and misinformation campaigns, targeting individuals, businesses, and democratic institutions alike. We'll explore some of the social and economic risks and associated costs of AI-enabled cybercrime on individuals, societies, and markets, and discuss government and institutional responses, including the need for effective multilateral cyber-deterrence strategies. Joining me for this dialogue is John Davenport, a philosophy professor at Fordham University in New York, specialising in moral and political philosophy, including democratic theory, human rights, and global governance. A prominent thinker, he's written extensively on contemporary threats to democracy and is the author of The Democracy Amendments and A League of Democracies. And I can see that John has arrived, so do let me invite him in. Hey, John.
Hi.
I'm so glad you're here. Thank you very much for joining me. These are really extraordinary times, I believe. I mean, where do you start? Really, I mean, we've scheduled a dialogue on AI, but really we should be talking about the American Revolution. But there you go. So let's stick with AI for the moment. But just to kind of address the elephant in the room, are there a few words you want to say about what just happened in the US before we kind of dig into our main topic?
Yes, absolutely. I really think that that this is a whole new race, and that just can't be stressed enough. There have been polls that look at how well Kamala Harris does compared to Trump in various swing states, which are the only states that matter here, given our very strange electoral college system. But I think those polls are all very, I wouldn't say totally irrelevant, but not very indicative, because I mean, once someone is the candidate to be president, and it's for real, that just changes everything, and people take that candidate much more seriously. And so I think it remains to be seen, of course, how in the next, say, week or two, the polls will change. But I believe because there are just so many young people here, and so many people of more kind of moderate persuasion, but who were too worried about Joe Biden, they want to have someone to love, as it were, right? They want to be in the dating game, you might say. And so in this political dating game, I think the speed with which everything came together for the current vice president, I mean, really, people thought this might go on for weeks. It took 2 days, even, not even 2 days, for her to be hands down the choice of the party. I really think that she's gonna start out with sizable leads, and unless she blows it through a terrible debate performance or some bad statements, the race could be hers to lose. I think, I think it's very promising for her. In short, it's not that she's incredibly beloved yet by a lot of young Americans, but I don't think it'll be too hard for her to generate that enthusiasm. And it depends on some good policy and campaign advice. For example, if she were to put forward, in addition to the sort of jobs and economic issues that Biden has stressed, infrastructure, building, bringing manufacturing jobs back, people actually do look at the German model increasingly more, I would say. She could do something like, say, we want to restore or renew again the push to pass an equal rights amendment to our Constitution. This is the kind of thing that would bring out a lot of women, a lot of young people. So I think, let's put it this way. Trump is also not a young person, and doesn't come across
this is interesting. Up until now, Biden was the old guy. And now we have a 59-year-old, basically facing the old guy. But the old guy now, is called Donald Trump. So that's a really interesting role reversal. And of course, he's a prosecutor facing a convicted, felon. So you're looking at a really interesting scenario here. And I think that could play to her strength. I mean, it's not surprising at all that Trump has already said that he will not debate her, and that's obvious, why that is. But so she will have difficulties playing to her strength, given that he knows that he cannot face her. He wouldn't stand a chance. So he's going to play around her, and she's definitely the better kind of, if you like, the better, barrister, the better lawyer, the better prosecutor. But he may well be outsmarting her as a politician, and this is not so. It's still wide open and it's not clear. I mean, of course, what plays in her favor is that all the kind of attack ads that have been produced already to attack Biden cannot be binned, because of course they're now facing a new threat, and so they have to redo their entire campaign at a tremendous cost, and of course, with a huge time disadvantage, because of course the Democrats are still facing the same old enemy. So it's interesting. It really turned the tables. And also one point I think that's really worth making is up until Biden actually kind of made this really difficult decision, and I totally really I feel for him, because this has not been an easy decision to take for him. But until he took that decision, the Democrats look just as paralyzed as the Republicans, in the same way as they would not be able to kind of stand up to Trump for a long time, and increasingly it looked as if the Democrats cannot stand up to Biden as well. And with that change, we see a distinct difference between the two parties, one that can face reality and the other that can't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Trump looks like he's running a dictatorship within the Republican Party. I think that the Democrats can run ads showing Vance saying some really harsh things about Trump in the past. Vance used to be quite a different person. And so, I mean, it's going to be pretty easy for them to come out with negative attack ads. And it's sad that plays such a big role in our elections here, but it does, given the kind of unlimited, no holds barred funding of our election spending here, both the campaign and independent spending. So that's how it is. But Harris has already raised a ton of money. Now, Musk, has pledged money to Trump, and I don't know, will he follow through with this completely? It's a little bit puzzling to a lot of people exactly why he's done this. He doesn't. I don't know. Maybe he's got views on international affairs, Ukraine, Russia, and so on that he thinks are closer to Trump's. I think those could be deficits for Trump as well, though. I mean, she could almost campaign on the fact that, look, you're Musk's buddy. I mean, young people here hate Elon Musk. I mean, I don't really quite understand the man myself. So it's hard for me to judge, but he's an enormous negative for many people here. I do think that, I mean, Trump is also weak on foreign policy, but that's not Kamala Harris's greatest strength. So it would help if she would get some really good, advisors. I would say someone like Samantha Power maybe here would be, if you really want to have someone on your team who, is seen as very strong on, say, standing up to Putin, for example, right? She could bring in, on her team some good foreign policy advisors. And I think she needs to choose a vice presidential candidate from one of the swing states.
Right. That's right. I don't think that American elections are won or lost on foreign policy. So really, I think it would be a huge mistake for Kamala Harris at this point to focus on foreign policy. She needs to focus on the swing states. She needs to focus on working class. She needs to focus on the sort of the left behind, the swing voters, the people that would vote for Trump, either out of protest or out of hopelessness, and she needs to reach them, and for that she needs somebody who's male and probably white and probably from a swing state. And I think there are a number of really promising candidates in the wings, and it's going to be very, very interesting to see who she's going to pick. But now let's move on, because we have a topic that's actually related to this, because of course
Yes.
like Donald Trump in a way sort of turbocharged the whole fake news kind of development, because I think Republicans, and around, and Trump and the whole Trump campaign made excellent use of the new technologies and the whole the fake news machine for his
Mm.
last kind of like presidential run. And of course, it's going to play a major role in this forthcoming election as well, especially with people like Elon Musk sort of in the wings and other kind of like, this Thiel guy, this other kind of the other kind of tech people
Yeah.
on the far right that will throw their tech expertise behind this in rather nasty ways. Now, when we had preliminary chats, John, we were trying to figure out how to frame a discussion on AI, and
Mm.
specifically sort of like pointed out that misinformation campaigns and cybercrime in particular were major concerns of yours. And in fact, you've already started to write about this. So maybe we start there. Why
Yeah.
do you think that AI is going to have such a major impact on cybersecurity?
Well, I do. I really worry very much, very seriously about the appearance that people who are critical of AI, leave aside the boosters, those who are very enthusiastic, who think it's going to save the planet and so on. Put them to one side for a moment. Think about those who are critical. So many of them have focused on you might call doomsday scenarios, apocalyptic. Artificial intelligence suddenly starts reprogramming itself and quickly exceeds human. And this is what people call the AI takeoff, and then is weaponized in some way. And these are all kind of fanciful scenarios. But a little closer to reality is the use of artificial intelligence in war games and in running, say, armies of drones and robots and stuff. And I don't think that's too far away, maybe a decade. I mean, we already have sort of entered the drone age in warfare in a big way. Robots are next. This is going to look like something out of a Star Wars movie with all of these, robots won't look humanoid, but have all kinds of shapes and whole armies of them being driven by AI control. But even sooner than that, and more ubiquitous in its threat to humanity, will just be this kind of tsunami of fraud. And I do think, I mean, we already see, no one really knows how to quantify it, 40 billion a year, 60 billion a year, getting up to 100 billion a year in losses, to just ordinary scams that have become more and more clever at getting people to give away their password. All elderly people we know are especially likely victims. They think their bank is calling them, that there's an emergency, or that the federal government's calling them, or the tax authorities, and they have to give over all their information and their credit card number and so on. And ways of spying on people. I mean, hidden cameras becoming. So these are all sort of traditional scams that have already gotten smarter and more sophisticated at manipulating. I mean, human beings are finite, vulnerable creatures, right? Who, as smart as we can get educated on how to protect ourselves, but it's never going to be foolproof. And the scammers are getting better and better every year. And the response to them is more and more defense. For example, in relation to ransomware, the ransomware attacks have gone up, well, by over a factor of 10, in just a few years. I mean, is this going to go up another order of magnitude in the next decade? I mean, so with artificial intelligence, I'm worried that these scams are going to become so much more effective, because people will literally think, I believe I'm looking at a video of you and you're talking with me in New Jersey, but is it really me? I mean, if there's enough videotape of me online, that artificial intelligence program could put this video together and make it sound like I was talking with you because it's got recordings of my voice and so on. And you might think, imagine I'm your brother or sister or son, right? Or other relative, and I'm in a desperate situation and I need you to wire me money. And well, you get it, right? I mean, I think it could become so hard to recognize the fraud actually we enter an age where we can't trust most communication,
I mean,
which is
that's right. I mean,
just mind-blowing.
that's right. I mean, at the core of this argument, to me, seems to sit this problem that AI has already kind of, if you like, developed to an extent where it is very difficult, both for humans and for machines, to distinguish between human and artificial behavior. And it works
Mhm.
both ways. So algorithms are increasingly finding it difficult too to distinguish between human and artificial intelligence and behavior. So, there is this kind of idea that the whole business model that's based on sort of behavioral economics, like the Facebook thing. Facebook tracks
Mhm.
us and finds out what we like and don't like and serves us up ads that kind of reflect our interests and needs. Now, of
Right.
course, if fake Nikos and fake Johns are like basically kind of spooking around alongside the real Johns and the real Nikos, and the algorithm can't distinguish anymore, that whole algorithm breaks down. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is the very same companies that feed on these platforms, the kind of the Metas, the Googles, and the Apples and so forth.
Apple.
They are the very same companies that are also developing the AI. So they're kind of cannibalizing themselves at the moment. It's a very, very interesting thing. Now, but there's a philosophical question in this, which I didn't put in our interview guide, but I'm really interested in that because you
Okay.
do have, of course, a deep background in moral philosophy. Now, why is it that artificial and human behavior has become so indistinguishable? Is this something that you would consider that is intrinsically human about us, or is this just an illusion? In other words, do we have to accept that within, not too long, it doesn't matter whether I have a real friend or kind of a robot, which is just as good as a real friend? I mean, what is the difference here really from a kind of a moral, philosophical point of view, or from an ethical point of view, or from any kind of point of view between artificial and real?
Right. I certainly would maintain that there are some fundamental differences. The first being that human beings are conscious or aware or sentient, right? And it's very difficult this is a deep philosophical matter, as you know, to try to pin down why that is. We still don't know as much as neurosurgery and brain science has advanced. I would say we're not really any closer to figuring out why consciousness arises than Descartes was. I mean, we know that it has something to do with electric waves in the brain, but we have absolutely no clue why that leads to this kind of holistic experience of being here and sort of aware of both what's in the foreground and the periphery at once, and all the mysteries of consciousness. And with that, in human cases, go emotions and feelings, and the kind of the tactile, the visceral aspects of human awareness. I think all of these things can be mimicked, but human beings are also incredibly clever about detecting that sort of fakery in other people, and I think will quickly, as quickly as the AI programs adapt, I think human beings will adapt to try to figure out where, to look for little tells or flaws. Like, when playing a poker game, you'll see that the partner you're dealing with isn't completely real. I mean, I could be wrong on this. The algorithms could just be crunching so much information so quickly that human beings can't keep up, and the mimicking of emotions and eye movements and so on becomes incredibly convincing. I don't know how the large companies plan to help avoid these pitfalls, unless maybe they'll come up with a sort of a digital signature so that I have something that belongs only to me in my computing system, or my sign into the internet or whatever it may be, that shows that it's uniquely mine. So, an eye scan. But it just seems like anything they could come up with could be faked.
That's
And
right. I
so,
mean, the real interesting question here is, for me, is that what we can do is we can watermark a digital kind of thing. So we know, and we can agree
right.
that a certain watermark stands for whatever. And so we can
my
distinguish that
watermark
from
yours.
something else. Yeah, and the blockchain will obviously kind of help with that in a great way.
Right.
But of course, what would be so much better is if we would know, if we could identify the human rather than the fake. You know, wouldn't
Right.
that be really helpful? I mean, we have DNA testing in a crime scene. You know, we can sort of say, well, you know, there's DNA. It's a very, very high, you know, likelihood that a person committed the crime because his DNA was found or her DNA was found at the crime scene. You know, so there's a kind of a DNA of human presence. But you know, if you had a better understanding of what consciousness is, or even emotion, as you said, then we could distinguish the real thing from the fake thing much better, because otherwise there's so much variation in the real thing that, you know, it's very, very hard to really, we're probably left with some kind of watermarking to just literally kind of mark the fake rather than mark the real.
Yeah. And I mean, the good actors will follow those watermarking practices or whatever the agreed conventions are, but the bad actors won't. And even, you know, our DNA or parts of it could be recorded. Eventually, the amount of computing power needed to store all this information becomes prohibitive. So that's a different point. But I think, you know, it wouldn't be enough for me to have, say, a little device here that, you know, I put my finger in or a drop of blood even or something to prove that it's me each time, because that itself could be, I mean, anything that you can do virtually can be faked. We'll be having to ask people unusual questions that we know only they could answer and that AI can't guess. But I mean, eventually a digital pattern of the sort of questions we ask will be there as well. And we've reached the point where we're being followed by a kind of Orwellian monster that is growing, you know, exponentially, and we're not. And it's absorbing so much information about us that, I mean, this could lead to a point where if we're so untrusting of everything that we get in an email communication or a video or a phone call, documents sent to us by other means, we may not, I mean, this could cause, I believe, an economic crash because we've built an information economy. And so the trustworthiness, yeah.
That's right. I mean, essentially what we're looking at, I mean, when you're a much, you know, better historian than I am. But if I take a really kind of a superficial kind of like analogy, the Middle Ages, you know, where, you know, where the rule of law was patchy, you know, at best.
Right.
So what would happen? Cities would build walls, and guilds would certify craftsmen so that they would be allowed to, you know, carry out a craft or a trade or whatever. And so you'd have walls everywhere. You'd have walled cities, walled professions, wall. And this, you know, of course, is the opposite of an open democratic society, clearly. And you can totally see how we can protect ourselves by basically creating proprietary systems, you know, where we only allow trusted people in. And yeah, there'll be the occasional breach, and we would hunt them down, just as they must have done in the Middle Ages. And we sort of avoided the threat and back to the kind of the walled garden. And that's a kind of one future. And of course, it's not a democratic one, and it's a sort of very much like a sort of a kind of a city-state kind of notion of the world. And of course, there's a huge problem there with that. And at the moment, you know, we have open systems, and we are facing like some really kind of like important elections in the US, especially coming up in November. And we know the kind of, you know, the potential, the scope for abuse and the risks associated with that. So how do you think AI might or could undermine what has been a very fragile process to start with in a very fragile and polarized society? What could tip this whole thing over the edge? We're looking at a president who will only accept the elections if he wins. We're looking at a situation where a large part of the democratic electorate is quite disillusioned because of what's going on in Gaza and all the rest. We're looking at a really difficult kind of landscape politically for both parties and for the country as a whole. And there comes AI right in the middle of this. This is such a perfect storm. So let's think about this for a moment. What do you see the risks?
Well, first, let me just start on the general point and then come to the elections. I mean, the medieval problem that you're discussing, like everyone retreating to their little fiefdom and walling themselves in, today economists would talk about that in terms of transaction costs. We have so much security. Another sort of more prosaic equivalent of that is when every store has to have 10 security guards because there's so many guns out there in American society. But on the internet, just having so much of our costs be in terms of security to protect us from more and more and more sophisticated scams, I mean, that could end up being 10 or 15% of the price of every product, because we're running, it's like we create something to attack us and then we create something to defend against us. And I mean, the companies are making money on both ends of this, up to a point where the attacker becomes too hard to defend against. And this is a very bad economic model. It's like it's like the fallacy of believing that, well, your economy is growing because you're building lots of prisons and spending a lot on security guards and so on. This isn't actual growth that produces increases in human well-being, right? This is defensive growth, right? This is mitigating costs or problems, just like spending lots of money to mitigate harmful effects of climate change does not. Oh well, the economy is growing up because we're buying millions of air conditioning units. Well, that also, we're just getting back to where we were before we had the cost, right? We're not really better in human terms. So I fear that this is going to be a result of the kind of massive explosion and takeoff of fraud, right? All these inefficiencies, the transaction costs go up. And that's a real drag on economic growth and could cause serious recessions. But in terms of elections, it's even worse, because elections are so sensitive, as you say, here especially, but this is spreading, unfortunately, to other countries, because even just the appearance of untrustworthiness is enough to, once you lose, this is what economists call social capital, right? Various forms of trust, right? Once you lose the kind of shared sense that we mostly believe in the system that we're using here, right? That we trust that the umpires, which is mostly in the American case, it's often retirees or elderly people or people who are volunteering, who are working in the poll station for very little pay. It's like a little side job, who are adding up, what's been taken on election day and opening mail ballots and adding those in and so on. Once we started attacking those people and the little offices they work in. It's a very disaggregated system here. So just the fear that maybe there was a huge interference by some AI system in one state or even in one county in a swing state could be enough to sow this doubt, right? That it's enough to then, kind of drive the more militant part of the population crazy or over the threshold where they become hyper aggressive and they say, well, we're not going to certify the elections in our districts because you did this over here. And this is when the system starts to fall apart. It's a very fragile system in the sense that it depended on this kind of goodwill or public trust that we spent many decades building up since the early 20th century here, and that is even more after the civil rights era when the vote was sort of massively expanded in practice because more people could actually vote. And so we're losing something that is precious. I just voted in a primary election here and was struck by the fact that now in New Jersey, you have to submit a paper ballot, which is read by a machine, but they want to keep this paper trail, right? So this is another increase in transaction costs, right? Whenever you see this, it's like a telltale sign. So now you could imagine the state I live in is going to be collecting 10 million paper ballots, maybe. I mean, to store, warehouses full of these things and truckloads, and there'll be videos saying, oh, someone misplaced one of them or put one over, threw one away, or and so, I mean, the fact that we're forced to kind of go back to this older technology because people aren't trusting is a kind of canary in the mine to show you that things are deeply amiss, right? That we have to take these mitigating steps, these sort of defensive steps, so that we could go back and look at this whole paper trail and say, oh no, the election count was correct. Look, you can count the paper ballots yourself. But I mean, this is just, yeah, for one thing, it makes the elections cost more, but that's just the beginning of the problem.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, and the actual cost issue is quite, it's one aspect. There's another aspect which hasn't to do so much with cost, but has to do with sort of, if you like, a will to contribute or to participate or to be part of society, which is another, I think, another sort of, I mean, people just withdraw from kind of sort of collective practices, and it's just incredible. I mean, on the other hand, anybody who's ever experienced someone extending trust to you, how invigorating that is. I'll give you an example. I have this little house in Sweden, and it's got a sort of a septic tank, because it's in the middle of nowhere, so it's not connected to the main sewage system. And so what farmers traditionally would have done in the past, they would have kind of put holes into that septic tank so it wouldn't have to be emptied so often. It would be cheaper, but of course it would be massively polluting the environment. So what then happened was that the local council said, well, to prevent that, everybody has to have their tank emptied every year. It doesn't matter how full it is. So that way you have no incentive to cheat, because you have to pay for it anyway. And of course that is subcontracted out to people who actually come and sort of like empty the tank.
Now, they're making money. Yeah.
And of course, when your tank is only half full or not even that, I mean, who knows, who cares whether they actually did come and empty the tank or whether they just skipped a year and still pocketed the money. Because of course the tank wouldn't overflow because it wasn't full. So let's just skip that year and we'll still invoice and we'll still get the money. And this is what happened to me, because I'm not there all the time. So one year I get there and the tank was so full it nearly overflew. And of course that didn't make sense because you would never fill it in a year. So I ring up the local authority and I say to them, look, this is what happened. And they said to me, oh, that's terrible. We'll better refund you. And they just refunded without actually asking for proof or anything. They refunded 2 years of emptying because that must have been going on for a while. I mean, this would never, ever happen in Germany. In Germany, you'd have to provide photographic proof, and you would have to somehow prove how much buildup you'd have per year. And it would be a huge thing to prove that somebody cheated here. In Sweden, they just said, well, you wouldn't say that if it wasn't true, would you? It felt so good. It's you wouldn't
they believed you.
Yeah, and you would that kind of thing is totally gone from the kind of experience we have, in public life. Usually the assumption always is that somebody cheats, for good reasons, because that is the experience we all have. And of course, it's a huge cost, both financial, but also sort of moral and personal. So let's talk briefly about that personal cost that this whole build-up, in your view, sort of like imposes on people. How does that affect people's sort of social relations, in your view?
It's really grating and wearing on the nerves to have this sense that your fellow citizens have become, in effect, your enemies when it comes to elections. I mean, of course, people always disagreed and they had heated debates, but the election process itself, it's kind of, at that point, it's difficult to know what the right metaphor is to describe it, but it's more like, oh, well, now that's over and we're just talking friendly, at the polling station or at the vote. It's sort of like, well, that was a friendly rivalry, but now after the football match, after we've been beating each other up, we're sharing a drink in the bar and we're having, that's all gone, right? It's now the war over the counting of the ballots themselves and the certifying of the elections. And all of these things are quite vulnerable. And it feels almost like, once the venture capitalists discovered that they could raid companies that have been going on a while and have some weak points and destroy them and sell off their products, it's now like, the lawyers or the more aggressive teams have reached the election polling stations and have decided to make a war about this, right? And so we have we have kind of a new front in the political war here. And this is it's a kind of an arms race. You could literally analogize it to war, where both sides have to hire more and more teams of lawyers. Local county courts, state courts, and so on are getting more and more lawsuits. And this is at every stage of the election process. So we were just talking here about the end, the counting of ballots, and here the certifying of electoral votes from states. So this is something that could go wrong because state legislatures here have some role in doing that, and governors of states play a role as well. It varies somewhat state to state, and there are complicated Supreme Court rulings on these matters. But even from the very beginning, like a small county, which only has maybe, 15, 20 employees, covering a pretty large territory of lots of small towns, now might be faced with massive lawsuits from these big groups who are trying to force them to throw people off the voting rolls because they say, well, you haven't re-registered people in the last 10 or 20 years. You need to kind of make everyone reprove that they live here. So it's just, you're hit with hundreds of millions of dollars of lawsuits if you don't give them what they want, and you don't have the resources to fight this, even though what they're trying to do is unjust. So it's this pressure at every point in the system, to the point where I think eventually, people will see that it sort of implodes, and we've got to rebuild a new kind of election system from the ground up.
Can I just
sure.
One thing that I find a really interesting question is that you make this very sort of valid distinction between the kind of sort of Carl Schmitt distinction, enemy friend kind of thing. But how do we get to that? I mean, Chantal Mouffe, a Belgian political scientist, she has this thing between agonism and antagonism. And agonism is very much the kind of the football example, where you kind of, you knock it out, and you basically, like in Parliament, the other side is not your enemy, but you're kind of the opposition. And there's a difference between an enemy and an opposing party, and it's a different,
right.
But what I would like to understand here is, how do we move from a kind of a situation of sort of an agonistic situation where we can be, we're sort of like fighting it out, and we kind of, we go to the ballot box, but we're friends again afterwards, to really an antagonistic situation where we do not stop there, where we, the kind of the Donald Trump, where we only accept an election if we win it. What is actually, what happens here, and what role does AI play in that shift?
Yeah, two things. Well, certainly AI is also going to become better at sort of targeting ads, not just to regions, but to individuals and so on to know. I think two things are really driving this shift, as you said. I mean, that is a helpful conceptual distinction. It's like, the difference between two Olympic athletes who you actually need the other players in the Olympics, right? Or there's no contest, right? You can't do. So this is what philosophers following Alistair McIntyre call a practice, right? Where there's there's a collective good being generated by the rivalry. And so the rivalry is sort of contained within a larger sort of a quasi-friendship, right? Or a civic relation. And that's what, we had to some extent in elections here for many decades. And we're dramatically losing now. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that when you have a kind of a low turnout system, as we've had in the United States, where, creeping really ever since the civil rights era, part of the battle has been to try to make it harder for certain segments of society to vote. And so that's the legacy of racism in the United States, in part driving that. But once that becomes part of the system that people see as a fair tactic or something you can do to make it, there's some hurdles or obstacles to registering to vote, as opposed to, you mentioned Sweden. I think they have universal registration, right? Everyone is registered once they turn 18.
In fact, in Australia, it's illegal not to vote.
Yes, so these are high turnout systems, and we could do something like that here if we started kind of universally registering, or even if a more kind of modest version of the requirement to vote is you pay people $50 to vote or something like this, right? You give them a little like we give people a small payment for being on a jury in a criminal case, right? Because it's a civic duty or service, but this will compensate you if you lost some work time, or you needed to take a taxi to vote, or if we had a kind of a high turnout system, then we don't think that you're going to win an election by suppressing the turnout. That's not really a likely. But once that becomes baked in as sort of part of the system, then people start to use that lever. It becomes in a way, their strongest tool. And so what can drive turnout? What can drive the people on your party to go and vote? Well, it turns out one of the things is hatred, right? And strong emotions prove to be one of the things that will get a lot of otherwise disengaged people who think everyone else will do this for me, and I'm kind of a free rider, I don't have to go vote. Those people will get off their couch or seat and stop playing their video games and go vote because they're really angry, right? And because the other side is cheating, right? And so if you can convince people on your side who have leanings maybe towards your party that the other side is engaging in cheating and fraud and is trying to swindle them, well, I mean, you see how angry you would feel, right, if you thought that the septic tank company is swindling you, is robbing you, right? It's all the worse if in a really high stakes game, if you thought, well, I have $1 million on this poker game and the other side is cheating. Well, this is when the guns start to fire, right? People get very angry. So it's a perfect storm here as well. It's like you can drive turnout, which decides the election because we have a low turnout system. You can drive that decisive turnout by militarizing your base through allegations of fraud.
And exactly, and of course, this is where AI comes in very effectively, just in the way as it can increasingly pinpoint sort of desires and needs. It can also increasingly pinpoint triggers, things that really get you going and make you really angry. And of course, like in a kind of a negative campaign, this is exactly what you want. So this is what, in a way, what we can expect to see, come October, like on Facebook and on Twitter and all these kind of platforms, is highly targeted, sort of individualized campaigns with the sole purpose of triggering hate and antagonism in people. Now, this is, of course, when you think about, that, surely this is something that for a society is incredibly unhealthy, and it becomes even more problematic when that triggering kind of takes on a globalized kind of like form, when there's other countries kind of getting involved in that, like as we can expect, for example, Russia to get involved in October as well in the kind of presidential campaign. And so what would you see there, and what do you see as the main concerns or the main issues there?
Yeah, and so while on the domestic front, I think the solutions, as I was indicating, partly have to do with just creating a high turnout system, lowering the amount of money that can be spent to end the arms race, because otherwise, that's in effect what our Supreme Court did in the Citizens United case by opening the floodgates. It just started an arms race. Everyone can spend infinitely on fighting the other side, and then all of these big strategies to manipulate the public become viable campaign strategies. But on dealing with interference on Twitter, on Facebook, on big social media apps where you have armies of bots or trolls, or which used to be human beings actually sitting in in an office, say in Moldova or somewhere doing this, is now increasingly going to be AI systems. I mean, so it goes up again by a factor of 10. There's going to be, so much kind of onslaught, just avalanches of false content being put out on these social media systems. One thing is to educate the public. It may eventually become somewhat self-defeating because people will stop believing so much. They'll realize that when they see a video of Trump apparently saying something terrible or Harris saying something terrible, it'll sink in at some point that, well, we can't really believe that video. I don't know, why should I think they really said that if I wasn't there in person? So we could have that kind of eventually kind of burnout or self-defeating effect with this onslaught of negative content, but we aren't there yet. And I definitely think that this kind of cyber propaganda campaign will play a huge role in this election. I think that the other fundamental kind of thing we have to learn in responding to this is to stop taking the attitude that the only recourse is better defense, right? That we just have to look for technical solutions. So Facebook and Twitter or X or other social media systems have to do a better job of weeding out these fake accounts. We have to have the FBI come out and indict people for doing this months later. All of these are sort of defensive measures. No, we need to go on the offense, right? I think you need campaign officials on both sides. And we really should beef up our Federal Elections Commission here with much stronger tools, and that requires passing laws where they could, kind of immediately start advertising to the public. Well, we know that today a new cyber propaganda campaign started on Facebook. We've traced this, back to sources connected with Putin or with North Korea, somewhat as was done with the war in Ukraine, actually, right? Intelligence was used to say even before, tomorrow you will see an ad, a set of ads coming ultimately from a Russian source saying that there are Nazis, in Ukraine's army, or so kind of, pre-warning the public, sort of inoculating people in advance. So that's a more aggressive response. But I think we almost need the political leaders in the system to come out and sort of alert the public, do primetime addresses and say, my fellow Americans, I'm here to tell you tonight that Russia has launched a cyber war on the United States, and this is what's happened. Something that makes it really serious, not like, oh, well, this is just the everyday normal now, that we're attacked by this kind of cyber war that are attacking our elections. It needs to somehow be put on the public radar that these are attacks, that they're the equivalent of a kind of warfare.
Well, this is the thing, John. I mean, there's something underlying the current approach. Is that a cyber attack isn't a real attack?
This is the problem, the mindset.
So there is this kind of, well, it's only virtual. It's not real. And this kind of distinction between virtual and real, between offline and online, there's a distinction, of course, to be made. Just as there's a distinction between biological and chemical, and between this and that and the other. There are different domains. But it's not the same as saying that the one domain is entirely, fair game, and the other one, if I attack you physically, if I beat you up, there is a clear set of rules and laws that'll kind of, that'll prevent that from happening. And if it does happen, I will have to bear the consequences. With cyber attacks, if I beat you down like online, through anything from revenge porn to fake news to all the stuff that we label on migrants coming up from Mexico, what we call them, this and the other, right through the kind of the international and global attacks you mentioned with Putin and what have you. We need to kind of begin to think about the online sort of sphere as as real as offline, don't we?
Yeah, and I think it might take some pretty dramatic symbolic actions by political leaders to kind of sort of get the public to realize that we should be thinking of these as acts of war. So one thing, as I mentioned, is you can come out and just say this, right? That my fellow Americans, what Russia has done, in trying to hijack or sabotage our election this year is the equivalent as if they put 1,000 Russian agents working at 1,000 American newspapers who published 5,000 fake articles. If that was done with actual spies, right, with people doing in the old-fashioned way, right, the kinetic way, pre-cyber, people would look at that and be shocked. My God, right? You put 1,000 agents into our country to manipulate our newspapers, and so, that would be seen. Well, it certainly would have been seen in classical norms as a casus belli, right? As grounds for war. maybe it's got to get to the point where, I mean, the political leader could say, if this is repeated, the next time I am going to, I don't know, drop a bomb on an unmanned facility or something, so that the next time the public registers, wow, I don't know, a natural gas transfer station somewhere in the Arctic was blown up because, Russia did this again, and launched a new series of fake ads saying to people that election day is a week later than it really is, right? We have these sorts of tricks, for example, right? That we're not going to tolerate these. We consider this acts of war, and to prove that we do, look, we just destroyed something, right? There was a kinetic response. I'm not sure that in the long run that anything less than that will work. What will not work, this I'm sure of, is just to kind of keep increasing our defenses. Because unlike the medieval case, there's no wall thick enough and no wall high enough.
Well, actually, there was no wall thick enough in the medieval case either, interestingly enough.
Right, as it turned out, right.
but there's one interesting kind of sort of area with in the law, which I think is worth looking at, and that's the kind of domestic violence legislation. For a very long time, domestic violence has meant physical violence. A man beating his woman, to the extent that you would have black eyes, and you'd see the physical abuse on her body, and anything short of that wasn't really abuse. This notion of emotional abuse is a fairly new idea.
And the revenge porn you mentioned, yeah, right.
Because it's not physical, it's emotional, it's at a different level, and there is a sort of an interesting equivalence between the kind of the physical and emotional abuse kind of distinction in domestic violence versus the physical and kind of virtual abuse or attacks, because of course they do leave very deep scars, those virtual attacks, on so many levels. Both, when they're targeted individuals, they can lead to suicide, they can lead to trauma, they can lead to lifelong conditions, and indeed a cost for the health service. But of course, they can also lead to people picking up a gun and shooting someone. There's that. So there's a very real cost associated with that as well. And for some reason, we don't really take that into consideration. We don't treat it as seriously as, by now, emotional abuse in a kind of domestic context.
It's starting. I think people are starting to learn. They don't quite know how to respond to this yet, but they're starting to learn that cyberbullying is something that can be fatal and that needs to be really taken seriously. And it's a good analogy, right? Because again, it's cyber. I mean, to the extent that we start to recognize that is like, this is a real sort of attack. It needs to be taken as seriously as a physical attack. It could even be more damaging, in fact, right, in some cases than a mild physical attack, because it could lead
the long-term effects could be much more severe too. I mean, that's the same with emotional, cases. Is that the long-term effects are often far greater in emotional abuse than in physical abuse. I mean, taking a beating is a really bad thing, but being sort of exposed to emotional abuse over a longer period of time is, at least as brutal, if not more brutal.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and this is also unfortunately connected with AI, because we now have systems where, unfortunately, it seems that young people are able to create artificial images of their classmates with no clothes on, right? This is the kind of this gets out on the internet, and then teenagers are committing suicide. So again, there are the defenses against this. We can say we're going to take this very seriously. We're going to expel students from school if you do this. We can also make laws that say, for example, we are not going to treat anything that's generated this way, or if you've hacked into someone's account to get, private photos, whatever, we're going to kind of rule in advance that we consider all of this fake. You can't use any of this to blackmail people. That defense only goes so far. On the other side of it, you have to have the sanctions, right, to respond to this. But I mean, to the extent that we do start to take that seriously, we're recognizing that the fact that something is done in a cyber form does not make it innocuous, right? It could be very serious indeed. That's another kind of immediate effect of AI, unfortunately, is that the capacity for cyberbullying And for just, straightforwardly hacking into the account of someone you don't like and using that against them becomes so much easier, right? And it's creating all kinds of negative, emotional effects across society. We don't even yet know, I think, exactly why this fellow shot President Trump, right? We don't know why, former President Trump was attacked in that way by someone who was a Republican, or at least nominally, registered as a Republican. But we do know that young man had been bullied quite severely in school. Classmates did say this. And I guess at some point we'll know to what extent that happened online as well. But this led to an action that was very serious indeed, right? And the consequences of which I don't even want to think about what would have happened if he actually had been killed or seriously injured. I mean, this itself could have caused, I don't know, cities to burn here, right? I mean, there could have been rampages and, mob violence and, all because of cyberbullying, perhaps.
It's interesting. It's almost as if a whole new body of law would be required, because of course what you do have is you have attacks on individuals, anything from revenge porn to cyberbullying to all kinds. Of course, you have the kind of the attacks on groups like refugees or whatever, and then you have the attacks on a whole country. Like when Russia interferes with the elections in November. So these are very different levels,
right.
very different domains. But of course, what must be clear is that an attack on a country or an attack on a group is also an attack on every single individual in that country. So it's not just that it's an attack on the American, people. It's also an attack on every single individual within it, and they have to individually live with that cost too. So it's yeah, and the range of offenses, and of course, then there's businesses and the economic cost. We've already talked, from ransomware to all kinds of other transactional costs that kind of go up because of the lack of trust and the uncertainty that AI kind of induces into the whole trading system. So and the volatility and so forth. So that's all. Yes, please. Yeah, you want to come in there?
Two things, if I could jump in on this is the quicker point. I think actually the ransomware problem, as terrible as it has become, and it really has just, again, growing exponentially, this, I think, is something that can be solved fairly straightforwardly by law, believe it or not, by simply making it illegal to pay the ransoms and attaching really kind of draconian monetary penalties to do that, so that if a company were to pay the ransoms, that they would be subject to fines that would bankrupt them. And I know that sounds like attacking the victim, but what it produces after, just a year or two, a few rounds of the ransomware attacks stop coming because they don't generate any money, right? The companies literally can't pay. Now, it's devastating for those initial victims who can't pay the ransoms and retrieve their lost data and software.
Well, and this is of course a tried and tested policy, isn't it? Because of course it's exactly what the US does vis-a-vis terrorists. They do not negotiate, they do not pay ransom for so, and as a result of it, there are very, very few American people taking hostage. Other countries pay ransom, and it's much more lucrative than to basically take citizens of those countries hostage. It's a kind of there's a kind of a case there, isn't there?
Yes, and so, it is, in a sense, putting the costs mostly on the victims. So that policy should be paired with an effort to kind of, go after the people who are launching the ransomware. And this is connected to the other point I wanted to make about the whole sort of structure of the internet, which if you think about how the internet's developed in the last mostly 20 years, but going back to the 90s, right? It developed sort of on the model of like the Swedish trust thing that you were describing, that we roll out the internet. It's not owned by a company. It's not proprietary. We're not making royalties on this. It's sort of given out as free software to the world. We'll show you how to connect all these computers. And now we have this global network that's enormously beneficial to everyone because it massively reduces transaction costs. It provides this, it's a sort of a giant assurance game is what game theorists would call it, right? And so by playing nicely on this, by using it well, we make it more beneficial to everyone who's connected with the network. And what's happened is eventually bad actors have learned how to prey on that. Right. But because of the way that it was designed and developed across the world, we don't have any way to say, well, since this country over here turns out to be the source, of 30% of the ransomware attacks in the world, or 40%, let's say, we're going to cut this country off from the internet. Right. If you could do something like that and just say, we're now, that's a kind of like a segregation or a shunning punishment. Right. If we can punish you by exile, right? By sending you out of the system.
It's like a
but we have no way to do that. So I could reach the point where we might have to rebuild the entire internet from the ground up, is the prediction I'm going to make. In the long run, over the next maybe 3 decades, something like this might be needed, where we have a system that is controlled by good actors from the outset, in a way that, they have the power through collective decision-making process, right? That's fair. And, this is not done for political gamesmanship, but is done simply, to preserve the integrity of the system. So we could cut off, sources that are the origin point of a lot of malicious content. The problem then would be using the blockchain technology so that we can trace correctly where it's coming from and so on. But in principle, that should be possible, given blockchain. And so it's just that we can't do it with today's internet. We could also end up then in a world where you have 2 internets, right? You have the sort of safe one that is controlled by the good actors in the world. And then you have this other internet that is controlled by Beijing and Moscow and North Korea, and is sort of used by all the bad actors in the world, but they'll try to force.
We have that already, don't we? We've got what's called the dark web, which,
I guess,
and we have, which isn't actually in itself bad, but because it's dark and you're untraceable, it's used also by good actors who, kind of stand up to human rights in places where it's very dangerous to do so.
Mm-hmm.
That's, of course,
right.
also used by bad actors. It's used by anyone who doesn't want to be seen, hence the dark web, whereas the World Wide Web, which is what we call the internet, is the kind of the bright web, where ideally you want to be seen and ideally everybody sees you. But of course,
right.
you're absolutely right. The problem, of course, is that if the predictions are correct, we may well reach general intelligence, like a level where AI is equal to or more intelligent than we are within the next 3 to 5 years. This is what I hear. What is a kind of, they used to talk, 10, 15 years down the road, but they've kind of shortened this more and more and more. And they're now talking like 3 to 5 years. This doesn't give us much time to think about a governance infrastructure and a new kind of, if you like, social contract for the digital world. And so, when you look at these kind of time compression, issues, what do you see happen? How do you see this? Where do you see the real short-term conflicts, problems, and potential solutions over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, you're right. It's coming quickly, and we just don't know what will happen once these systems, which now are mostly just learning to copy and mimic content that's already on the internet, but once they get the capacity to sort of reprogram themselves how they learn, and then do that new kinds of learning, right? How quickly they will take off and start to be able to do things that we can't completely predict. We won't have a functioning global government in 5 years. It's very unfortunate for humanity that we've reached this technological point before we had this kind of really functioning world system. So we're faced with a situation where, even if software of this kind, sort of general intelligence systems were banned in certain countries, they would just be developed in other countries that don't have this ban, right? Because we don't have global law. We have no easy way of enforcing that. And so Yeah, I think we're unfortunately at the moment stuck with hoping that the programmers who are making these systems will program into them norms, and principles that keep them benevolent, right? And it might be to the extent that a lot of this is still controlled in Silicon Valley, and that's what the American developers will tell you. I heard this in Copenhagen last year for myself with, well, the head of Polaris was one of the people there, for example. So he's very optimistic that the people who are developing this kind of towards general intelligence software are willing to put into it safeguards of various kinds. So maybe in the short run that will remain true. It would be good even if they maybe put into the program some kind of, I don't know, secret backdoors or capacities to flag attempts to misuse them, so that this would be reported back, or make the system unusable to someone who tries to do something really malicious with it. So maybe in the short run, we will see protections kind of baked in by the people developing it. But how long can that really last, right? It will not last beyond, say, a decade, at the point where, another thing we don't know is what's going to happen when quantum computing becomes more widespread, right? And can really be developed on a sort of on run by Google. But once it becomes possible to do quantum computing, at a much larger level across the world, it does seem like, those systems are very much faster, and when combined with AI software. So maybe we will see all the great effects. It will suddenly discover how to cure cancer, right? It will, discover how to quickly, I don't know, it'll show us how to produce cold fusion, and we won't have any energy worries anymore because it will have discovered how, we can get sort of infinite supply of cheap energy without even needing uranium or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can totally see how a sort of an enlightened liberal government will kind of somehow manage to steer that development in a way that we just about managed to get away with it. But I can also foresee a situation where in November, Donald Trump becomes president of the United States. And then maybe decides, well, actually, the last term I was president doesn't really count. It's my first term. I start again from scratch. I'm going to do another 2 terms now. And I'm going to be a 3-term president. And in fact, there was a 3-term president. And why stop there? Like, I mean, Putin didn't, like Xi doesn't. And of course, so there's a history to this. And you can see how dark this could be and how enabling AI could be to solidify that darkness. I mean, I think, we can all build that as an image, but it just shows how important it is, I think, that Trump doesn't win in November, because if he does, who knows what will happen.
And the temptation to use this sort of, even today's AI, let alone general intelligence, to use this to become a kind of complete monitoring of every single thing that everyone in one's society is doing. The temptation to do that, coming initially from the police, but also defense forces, is already there even in democratic countries. So, I mean, as we know that, China already has internally all of these systems to monitor whatever's being done on the internet within China. And this reaches out to the diaspora around the world, the ability to pressure people who might have relatives in China or business connections in China. So we can expect all of those sort of effects to increase, right? So we have this is like Orwell squared, right? It's going far beyond George Orwell's worst nightmares as to the level of surveillance that these systems may be able to do.
And of course,
and the ability to just steal any data that's hidden as well.
That's right, and I'm sure. I mean, most people realize that it isn't just the Chinese. I mean, the NSA's, behind that just as much as Mossad and the Bundesnachrichtendienst in Germany and all of them. This is a free for all, and I can't see any one of them to kind of take a back seat because this is just too good to be true.
So we're going to have to redesign all of those communication systems, the phones, everything will now be encrypted, right? And so we're going to have, again, these are defensive costs, right? And then we're going to have AI, and maybe no encryption will really work with general intelligence AI. But this is another war, right? The AI systems will be developing better encryption that no human being could ever decrypt within even over 100 years, right? And then the de-encryption system. So we've launched another kind of an arms race here with just spiraling costs, and even leaving aside defense, but just within ordinary technology, again, what your devices are recording in your home or your car and so on, and what's being shared with the world, these sort of massive protection systems to encrypt everything, I think will be part of the result of this in the short term. And it's just, by not controlling the uses of these very powerful tools at the outset, we just make so many costs for ourselves.
That's right. So to wrap this up, John, because you were beginning to run out of time, but this is such an interesting conversation. I'd love to carry it on. But just to wrap it up, could you just in a few sentences reflect on what you've just said, and to think about what kind of short-term, medium, and long-term measures, like say, for example, a new American administration coming in November should take to safeguard against the most problematic and the most dangerous of those developments?
Yeah, probably four things immediately, right? So to start doing in response to cyber propaganda and sabotage, right? What I said earlier, right? Start calling this out, start, really making this a big deal to the public, maybe and sort of threaten, serious countermeasures. That's step number one. The second thing they can do is quickly pass a law outlawing ransomware payments, and backing that up with maybe with funding to help victims who are unable to pay, right, given the new law, something like this. The third thing would be to, already just to continue the trajectory that we've got going. The United States and our European allies have realized at this point that we need to develop, our own chip-making capacities. Taiwan, for one thing, is under threat, and that, is the source of so much of the world's computer chips, semiconductor systems, and so on. So these are kind of simple, protection measures so that we can be assured of the outset of those securities, right? A fourth thing, though, is to quickly start implementing laws here of the kind that Europe has already started to develop on, the privacy of one's data, and to insist that protections for for privacy be built into these new AI systems. And beyond that, I suppose, beyond those four things, other measures would probably have to be taken, at a more clandestine level, unfortunately, right? That I don't know that we can even tell the public what the government is going to have to negotiate with the developers of general AI systems, protections of various kinds to mitigate against their malicious use. But in the long run, there's going to have to be this, kind of broad rethinking about how to make our communication systems in an age of artificial intelligence more fraud resistant, and to try to provide the public with greater levels of assurance. So I don't know, maybe you have a labeling system on communication. So you've got 4 levels, just like we have somewhat ratings on movies, so we know not to send a 12-year-old to something with really explicit content. We might have to have, here is a very highly protected, encrypted communication that you're having with the board of your company or something on Zoom. And it's resistant to, to most kinds of surveillance. Whereas if you and I are just chatting now, there's no real incentive to hack into our conversation. This has a little label on it that shows a lower level of security, right? And so that people are constantly aware that they're using less secure forms of communication. These are fairly easy steps that government can take in the short run. I know that there are people, I know one of them actually in American government, who are working, to try to prevent cyber sabotage of elections. But I do think, from what the strategy is at the moment in the American government, that it's all defensive and it doesn't have this more kind of offensive component to it that it probably needs to have to really work, to really deter the attacks. In the long run, of course, it would help us if there were other measures taken, other ways of trying to improve the nature of regimes across the world, right? If we had a democratic Russia and a China, pointed in the direction of democratic reform in the long run, this would greatly simplify our task. We would still have problems with general intelligence, but all of this is just so much worse if we're in a new Cold War. So, right, I mean, improvements on that political front achieved maybe through other techniques. But without this, if we are stuck in a new Cold War for a long time, we're facing just enormous costs in new forms of arms races, AI-driven armies of robots, AI-driven satellites. It's not a pretty picture at all.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked about a sort of, like in another context, but somewhat related context, about the need for a League of Democracies. Because, of course, many of our problems, be it climate related, be it geopolitical, many of our problems are of a global nature, and they can't really be solved by a single country. And of course, democracy, or the very concept of democracy, has come under attack from sort of authoritarian or certainly illiberal kind of regimes. And so do you see any kind of for example, existing multilateral organizations like NATO, or like, I mean, the EU, the European Union, of course, already does take measures at a supranational level. But do you see like a role there for like something like a NATO, or what you're kind of dreaming of, a sort of a League of Democracies?
Yes, which is a stronger, like a global NATO, but with these other political components where the League could take action by majority votes or supermajority votes that aren't unanimous to try to decide things like the management of the global internet. And I think these problems with cybersecurity and with the kind of integrity of our communication systems could actually drive democratic countries, more or less democratic countries, let us say, not perfect, towards this kind of greater cooperation at a global level quite quickly, because just of the sheer scale of the problems that we've been discussing. And that could have the effect of saying, well, look, if we're faced with a new Cold War where, the adversary is actually much stronger than the Soviet Union used to be, and is, now armed with new forms of technology that, the old Cold Warriors wouldn't have thought of in their worst nightmares, right? That this sort of a global system, even if it isn't a full League of Democracies yet, but more kind of rule respecting nations, will collaborate to try to create this sort of safer internet or safer spaces within the existing World Wide Web, more in the short run, but maybe in the long run, building a whole new system. And so, that will put pressure on these bad actors to say, well, if you don't start, contributing to the safety of these global systems that we all rely on, if you use your position to try to sow doubt and distrust, it serves their purposes at the moment to, make everyone here distrust the reliability of anything said in political communications here, to try to destroy the kind of basic levels of trust on which democracy believes. If they keep doing that they're going to be isolated from these communication systems, or banned or exiled in ways that are crippling, that they couldn't afford to accept, right? I think in the long run, that's how this kind of global cooperative scheme could put great pressure on those rogue actors, those bad regimes, to try to reform what they're doing and try to support a safer global web. In the long run, it might also require, some kind of cryptocurrency control. And I know that's very controversial as well, but just because of the connection between cryptocurrency and various forms of fraud. I'm not saying you could have a legitimate cryptocurrency or global e-coin of some kind, but it would have to be run by this league, right? It would have to be run, we're a global consortium of countries. This would reduce, foreign currency exchange in the same way that the euro made things more efficient within Europe and helped growth in Europe. But it would also have to be, you could never do this until we know that the systems that run it are safe from, imagine, if the whole global currency system collapsed in the way that, computers did do in the last few days due to the CrowdStrike problem, right? You couldn't have a global currency system that's going to do what humanity needs it to do without massive levels of assurance behind it.
No, absolutely. The thing is, with cryptocurrency, there's so much, that could be done if it would move more into the mainstream. You could even think about like the Fed coming out with a kind of a sort of like a
e-coin,
a virtual dollar, and you could see how you manage the money supply in the US, by basically keeping a balance between virtual and physical money. So there's so many different ways in which you could introduce virtual forms of money that are legit or that are kind of, but of course, one of the big attractions of crypto is that it isn't traceable, that it has that kind of, so how successful a virtual but traceable currency would be, that's not clear, because it's, everybody, everybody's transactions would be very much in the public, and people don't particularly like that. I think it's indeed one of the reasons why people still like cash, because you can you can pay somebody, without the the inland revenue or the tax collectors knowing about it. And I think with
the tax is the main thing.
Yeah, that's right. And so with an official cryptocurrency, that would no longer be possible. But I get your point. I get your point, and there are real issues, like with anything that is untraceable and that is essentially anonymous and, very opaque. And of course, that goes, both for the internet as a whole, and goes for crypto. And of course, the whole issue with AI and fake news versus real news.
This is all part of the problems of sort of cyber sabotage, ransomware, as we just think about the sources connected to Putin for a moment. And the evidence of this is just, a simple list of bullet points on everything that the Kremlin has done in the last 20 years would fill hundreds of pages. It's just, the series of attacks are just unbelievable. They're enormous. That's connected to the ability to have, all these hidden kind of offshore accounts, cryptocurrency transactions to avoid sanctions, the ability to, get funding sources through to get, enough revenue for nefarious actions through ransomware attacks. These things are all part of one ecosystem. And so, the ability to clamp down on ransomware attacks and, dark money transfers really does put pressure on dictatorial regimes, because they're becoming more and more dependent on those kinds of systems. So that's really where we're vulnerable here in our election systems, as we've been describing, but they're vulnerable in their dependence on these kinds of, sort of hidden or clandestine systems and programs that, that could maybe be destroyed by kind of better collaboration among well-meaning regimes. And so that's where I do think, the creation of a safe global coin or international coin regulated by a bunch of governments would help a lot. But with that goes also closing down, tax havens and going after countries that make it easy, as we saw with the Panama Papers, to run a kind of a clandestine sort of mob organization across many borders. You think, the whole kind of ecosystem around Putin, with all of these, different billionaires with forms of offshore accounts and, clandestine funds, is really essential for what his regime has been doing. Without it, his chances of persisting would be much weaker, right? So if we can weaken that system on which his regime depends, I think it would. But you're right that just from the point of view of ordinary citizens within a democratic country, if their government said, well, we do have a record of all of your transactions in the banking system, but we're not going to look at it. It's held by an independent, watchdog agency. People won't believe that. That's the problem, right?
No, that's right. That's right.
And so people have to be willing for their transactions to be known, or else they'll try to use, well, the same systems that currently the Maduro regime is using to get money from Russia, for example, right, as part of that kind of dark money transfer systems. It's not widely known in the public, but the Financial Action Task Force that started the first decade of this century, around like 2004 and 5, the attempt to kind of protect the global banking system against forms of wire fraud and forms of money laundering made significant progress, right? We actually have a lot of expert knowledge and ability to kind of prevent misuse, say, of the global SWIFT system and stuff. So the global banking system has a certain level of resilience in it, but the question now is, for a collection of democratic or generally rules-respecting countries to expand that to the global level with a crypto, with a global e-coin.
Yeah. No, I think there is a sort of a healthy balance, if you like, between chaos and order, between sort of light and shadow.
Yes.
I think AI has the capacity to increase the shadow and to kind of reduce the amount of light. But this is exactly the thing. And I think if you have only order, it becomes quite a terrifying system. If you've got only chaos, the same would apply. So, and with AI, that apple cart has somehow been shaken. And what we have to do is find a way of rebalancing chaos and order. And let the forces find a new equilibrium that is healthy for a democracy, that is healthy for society, and that is also healthy for individuals within that. And that is a really, really difficult task. And I think it's conversations like ours today that, I don't think we've come up with any grand scheme or great answer here, but it's very much these discussions that we have to have and have to have more often. So I would like to kind of, really kind of continue that and see where that leads us. I think in a year or two, we will be a lot wiser in so many respects, and a whole host of new problems will have popped up, in the meantime. So let's rest this for the moment. Thank you very, very much for joining me this morning, or I should say in Europe this afternoon. It's been a great pleasure, and it's been very illuminating as always talking to you. Thank you very much, John.
Me too. I learned a lot. Thank you, Nico.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
We'll catch up soon. Thank you.
Wish us luck with our election. We need it.
Of course. Both, fingers crossed, both hands. All the best.
I'll tell you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.